The air in the cave was thick, a foul cocktail of damp limestone, cordite, and the sweet, metallic scent of blood. It was June 22, 1945. On the island of Okinawa, the great battle was breathing its last shuddering gasps. For weeks, this subterranean world had been a sanctuary and a tomb for the student nurses of the Himayuri Gakutotai and their Imperial Japanese Army wards. Above, the world had been reduced to a symphony of annihilation, the ceaseless drumming of American naval guns, the roar of fighter bombers tearing the sky, and the stuttering cough of machine gun fire. But now an unfamiliar sound had replaced the cacophony. Silence. A heavy, profound quiet that was more terrifying than the noise it replaced. And then another sound. Voices. Speaking a language they had been taught was the tongue of devils. English. Inside the cave, huddled in the gloom, a group of young women waited. They were no longer the bright-eyed students who had been mobilized from their classrooms just months before. Their crisp school uniforms were gone, replaced by rags stained with mud and the fluids of the dying. Their hands, which should have been turning the pages of textbooks, were calloused from carrying stretchers and blistered from digging graves. And in those hands, many of them clutched their final lesson, the Type 99 hand grenade. It was a small, pineapple-shaped object, heavy with the promise of an honorable death, Gyokusai, the shattering jewel. To die for the emperor was the greatest glory. To be captured by the American beasts, the Kichikubeihei, was a fate worse than any death. Their teachers, their officers, the very air they breathed in Imperial Japan had drilled this into their souls. The Americans were hairy, red-faced giants who would inflict unspeakable tortures upon them before the inevitable, dishonorable end. The grenade was a key, a final violent escape from a future of unimaginable horror. As the shadows of the American soldiers darkened the mouth of the cave, their silhouettes alien and menacing against the harsh Okinawan sun, fingers tightened around pins. This was the moment foretold, the end of all things. To understand the depth of their terror, one must understand the world that had forged them. The Japan of the 1930s and 40s was a nation in the grip of a powerful, intoxicating fever. It was a society meticulously engineered for total war, where the individual existed only to serve the collective will of the state, embodied by the divine emperor. From the moment a child could walk, they were saturated with the ideology of Yamato Damashi, the unique superior spirit of the Japanese race. School was not merely for education, it was for indoctrination. Textbooks depicted a sacred Japan, beset by jealous and greedy Western powers who sought to strangle their divine destiny. The United States, in particular, was cast as the ultimate villain. Propaganda posters, visible on every street corner, showed demonic caricatures of American soldiers, often with fangs and claws, menacing innocent Japanese women and children. Radio dramas and state-sponsored films reinforced this narrative daily. Americans were portrayed as lazy, materialistic, and monstrously cruel, a degenerate race incapable of understanding the pure, martial spirit of Bushido. This psychological conditioning was codified in the military by the Senjin-kun, or Field Service Code, issued by War Minister Hideki Tojo in 1941. It was a document read by every soldier, sailor, and airman. Its most infamous line became the de facto law of the battlefield. Do not be taken prisoner alive. Surrender was not an option. It was a metaphysical stain upon one's family, one's ancestors, and the emperor himself. It was the ultimate betrayal. This ethos permeated the civilian population as well, especially on islands like Saipan and Okinawa, which stood on the doorstep of the homeland. Here, the line between combatant and non-combatant was deliberately blurred. Civilians were trained to fight with bamboo spears. Entire families were expected to commit mass suicide rather than fall into American hands. On Saipan, American GIs watched in horror as Japanese mothers threw their children off cliffs before leaping to their own deaths, all while the remnants of the Japanese garrison charged into the muzzles of machine guns in a final, hopeless, banzai attack. This was the grim calculus of the war in the Pacific. The Japanese leadership was prepared to sacrifice every man, woman, and child to prevent the dishonor of defeat. The young women in the Okinawan cave were the products of this system. They were not merely nurses. They were soldiers of the spirit, armed with syringes and bandages, but also with the unshakable belief that their only noble path forward lay in self-destruction. The American soldiers who entered the cave moved slowly, cautiously. They were not the monsters of the propaganda posters. They were young men, barely older than the nurses themselves, their faces smudged with dirt and etched with a bone-deep weariness. They were Marines from the 1st Division, veterans of a campaign that had been described by their own commander as the most terrible and brutal in the annals of American warfare. They had seen their friends die in ambushes, watched booby traps eviscerate patrols, and fought an enemy who seemed to prefer death to life. They had every reason to be bitter, to be cruel. The nurses braced for the expected savagery, a shouted command, the rough grab of a hand, the prelude to the nightmare. Instead, a voice, surprisingly calm, spoke through a translator. "We are not going to harm you. Come out. We have water. We have medicine." It was a simple message, but in the context of their indoctrinated reality, it was utterly incomprehensible. It had to be a trick, a lie to lure them out into the open for slaughter. Yet no one fired, no one shouted. The Marines simply waited, their rifles held in a non-threatening posture. One by one, hesitantly, the nurses began to emerge from the darkness, blinking into the painful brightness of the day. They were a portrait of human misery, emaciated, covered in sores, their eyes hollowed out by trauma and starvation. They fully expected to be lined up and shot. Some still clutched their grenades, their last resort, their final defiant act of loyalty. An American corpsman, a Navy medic attached to the Marine unit, stepped forward. He was not a giant. He did not have fangs. He had kind eyes, and he carried a medical kit, not an instrument of torture. He knelt beside one of the nurses who had collapsed, her body racked with tremors. He gently took her wrist to check her pulse. This simple clinical act of human contact was the first crack in the dam of her conditioning. She flinched, but the hand was not violent. It was professional, steady. He offered her a canteen. The water was clean, cool. It was life. And then came the object that would, for so many, symbolize the profound, world-altering chasm between what they were told and what they were experiencing. From a field kitchen set up nearby, a soldier brought over a tray of metal cups, steam rising from them in the humid air. He handed one to the trembling young woman. It was coffee. The warmth of the simple metal cup seeped into her cold, trembling fingers. The aroma was rich, foreign, and deeply comforting. It was an ordinary gesture, 1,000 of which were happening on American bases across the world at that very moment. But in this cave on Okinawa, it was an act of profound and revolutionary kindness. It was a weapon more powerful than any artillery shell, for it targeted not the body, but the very foundation of belief. The young woman began to weep. They were not tears of fear or of sorrow for her defeated nation. They were tears of utter, soul-shaking confusion. The monster had given her a warm cup of coffee. This experience was not an isolated incident. As the battle for Okinawa concluded, and in the final weeks of the war across the Pacific, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians, driven from their fortifications by flamethrowers or simply too weak from starvation to continue the fight, fell into American hands. The official U.S. policy, in line with the Geneva Conventions, was to treat prisoners of war humanely. But for the average GI, it was often simpler than that. They were facing a defeated enemy who was, upon capture, often little more than a starving, sick teenager. Pity frequently overwhelmed hatred. Official records and personal diaries from the period are filled with accounts of this strange, disorienting transition from brutal combat to humanitarian aid. The journey to the prisoner of war camps was itself a revelation. The captured Japanese, men and women alike, were often carried on stretchers by the same soldiers they had been trying to kill hours earlier. They were given sea rations, tins of stew, crackers, and fruit, cocktail that, to their starved bodies, tasted like a feast from another world. For soldiers who had been subsisting on raw sugar cane, handfuls of uncooked rice, and sometimes even dirt and insects, the sheer abundance of American logistical power was a miracle. Each can of processed food, each clean bandage, each dose of sulfa powder was a testament to a system, a nation, that could fight a total war and still have enough left over to care for its enemies. In the camps, the process continued. They were deloused with DDT powder, a clinical and embarrassing yet necessary public health measure. They were given clean clothes, often surplus U.S. Army fatigues, which felt like silk against their skin. Doctors and nurses, many of whom had been treating horrific American casualties, tended to the wounds and illnesses of their Japanese prisoners with the same professionalism. One captured Japanese officer, interrogated in a camp on Guam, expressed this cognitive dissonance with stark clarity. His statement, preserved in U.S. military archives, reads, "We were told that if we were captured, you would torture us. You would cut off our noses and ears and pull out our fingernails before killing us. I was prepared to die this way. Instead, you gave me a doctor for my wound. You gave me 3 meals a day. You gave me cigarettes. How can I reconcile this with what I was taught?" This question was being asked in the minds of thousands of prisoners. The daily cup of coffee became a recurring symbol of this new reality. It was not a ration for survival. It was a creature comfort. It represented a world that was not entirely defined by brutal, fanatical struggle. It suggested a society where there was time and resources for a simple, warm pleasure. It was a small, daily ritual of normalcy injected into the insanity of their lives, and it began to methodically dismantle the propaganda they had been fed since birth. The aroma of brewing coffee for many became the smell of their first taste of a different kind of freedom, the freedom from a lie. The transformation was not instantaneous. For many, the initial reaction was one of deep suspicion. The kindness had to be a trick, a more sophisticated form of torture designed to break their will before the inevitable execution. In the camps, female prisoners often huddled together, speaking in hushed tones, trying to make sense of their situation. But days turned into weeks. The executions never came. The torture never began. Instead, there was a predictable routine, decent food, medical care, and a professional, detached courtesy from their American guards. The guards, for their part, were often baffled by their prisoners. They saw young women who had been taught to die for a cause now slowly, cautiously, beginning to live again. They saw the hard, fanatical shell begin to crack, revealing the terrified, exhausted, and confused young person underneath. The breaking point for many was the news of Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. For those in the camps, the Emperor's voice crackling over the radio, announcing the unthinkable, was the final, definitive shattering of their universe. The war was over. Their nation had not fought to the last man. The 100-million-fold Gyokusai had not occurred. Everything they had sacrificed for, everyone they had lost, was for a cause that had now admitted defeat. In the wake of this news, the American kindness they had been receiving was no longer a confusing anomaly. It became the only stable reality in their collapsed world. And it was then that the full emotional breakdown often occurred. Witnesses described Japanese prisoners, both men and women, who had stoically endured wounds, starvation, and the loss of their comrades, now weeping openly and uncontrollably. The tears were a complex flood of grief, relief, and a terrifying, liberating bewilderment. Grief for their dead, for their lost world, relief that the killing was over, that they would live, and bewilderment at the truth. The demons had been human all along. This realization was a heavier blow than any bomb because it meant their entire worldview, the very essence of their identity, had been built on a foundation of lies. They had been prepared to die to kill monsters, only to discover in the quiet humility of defeat that their monsters were just men, and that those men were capable of a compassion their own leaders had told them was impossible. Their ideology had not been defeated by force of arms alone, but by a cup of coffee, a clean bandage, a kind word. In the end, the story of these captured women is more than just a footnote in the history of a brutal war. It is a profound testament to a truth that transcends borders and ideologies. It is a story about the immense, often underestimated power of simple human decency. The American soldiers who offered water and food to their vanquished enemies were not acting on some grand strategic plan to win hearts and minds. They were acting on a basic human impulse, an impulse nurtured in a society that, for all its flaws, still held the individual as sacred. They were the products of a democracy that believed in inherent human dignity, a concept that was utterly alien to the totalitarian, emperor-worshipping militarism they were fighting against. The symbolic cup of coffee offered in the ruins of a battlefield represents the true abundance of that democracy. It is not just the abundance of material wealth, the endless supply of sea rations and medical supplies that so astonished the Japanese. It is an abundance of spirit, the capacity for empathy, the freedom to see the humanity in an enemy, the moral confidence to choose kindness in the face of hatred. For the young women who survived the caves of Okinawa, that simple, warm cup was their first lesson in a new kind of world. It did not erase the trauma of what they had endured, nor did it absolve the horrors of the war, but it planted a seed of doubt in the absolute righteousness of their cause, and a seed of hope in the possibility of a shared humanity. It was a quiet, unassuming gesture that carried within it the echo of a profound and enduring truth, that the most powerful weapon against an ideology of hate is not a more powerful weapon, but an act of grace that affirms a world where such hatred has no place. In the final accounting of the Second World War, victory was measured not only in territory gained and enemies vanquished, but in these small, quiet moments where the foundational lie of the enemy was exposed, not by a bullet, but by an unexpected and undeniable act of kindness.